Tonight, we uncover a story buried beneath centuries of faith, a rivalry older than any religion, and a secret that may change everything we think we know about divine power. They say the walls of Rome hold every secret, but some are buried far deeper, pressed into the mortar like trapped whispers, waiting for someone with enough insomnia and questionable judgment to go poking around after dark, which is exactly what you are doing as you walk through the Vatican's dim corridors breathed upon by pools of amber candlelight that tremble as though nervous about what you're about to learn. And even though the marble under your feet gleams with the usual polished reverence, there's an odd tension humming in the air, something between a gentle warning and a passive-aggressive nudge saying turn back while you still can because, as you will find out soon, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because I always imagine someone in a cozy room halfway across the world listening to Vatican conspiracies at 3 a.m. and wondering how their life choices led them here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together as you drift deeper into the Apostolic Palace, following a trail of soft echoes that feel almost scripted, as though the building itself is guiding you toward a chamber that, in theory, you are absolutely not authorized to enter. You breathe in old dust and wax and that faint metallic tang that ancient books give off. And at this point, you might as well accept that you're stepping straight into the kind of forbidden library moment every fantasy novel warns you about. Except this isn't fantasy. This is the Vatican, and the truth is always far stranger than the stories. As you push open a wooden door carved with cherubs who look suspiciously like they're side-eyeing you, you enter a small archive room where the air is still and heavy, like a theater waiting for its curtain to rise. And in the center sits a pedestal draped in linen so old it feels like it will melt if you breathe too hard on it. Though let's be honest, nothing in here is delicate, not when it's survived popes, wars, thieves, restorers, and that one intern in the 1800s who tried to clean a manuscript with olive oil because it seemed like a good idea. The pedestal shivers slightly as you approach, as though the object beneath it is alive, listening, judging, or perhaps stretching after centuries of being forced into divine silence. And when you pull back the cloth, every candle in the room flickers. A dramatic effect you'd normally assume was faulty airflow, except the Vatican has engineered its interior circulation to a degree of obsessive perfection that would make a modern climate control technician weep. Beneath the fabric lies the Codex Gigas, the manuscript the world cheerfully nicknames the Devil's Bible. Not because it contains satanic scripture, it doesn't, but because of the infamous full-page portrait of the devil staring out with cartoonishly enthusiastic energy that looks less like malevolent temptation and more like, hey guys, welcome to my TED Talk, which honestly raises more questions than answers. The mainstream historical fact is that the Codex Gigas was created in the early 13th century by a single monk in Bohemia. A manuscript so massive it weighs as much as a large toddler and requires two people to lift with dignity. And you can't help but appreciate how much upper body strength medieval scribes must have had. Especially since no one ever mentions monk fitness in history class, even though it's clearly a missed opportunity. But here's where it gets strange. Stranger than usual Vatican lore strange. Because the quirky, fringe tidbit whispered among some archivists is that this book occasionally moves a few millimeters overnight, not with alarming speed or intention, but with the stubborn wiggle of a heavy object that refuses to stay exactly where humans put it, a phenomenon usually blamed on vibrations, humidity shifts, or, if you ask the right old librarian, the devil adjusting his lumbar support, a joke, delivered deadpan enough to suggest they might not be joking. You run your fingers lightly across the edge of the binding, feeling its strange warmth, as though the vellum retains memories, and something inside you tingles. The sense that this manuscript is not simply old but awake, a presence that has been waiting centuries for someone foolish enough to lift its lid again. As you turn its first enormous page, you hear nothing but your own breath and the soft brush of parchment sliding against itself, yet the silence feels crowded, like a room full of unseen faces leaning closer. The ink glimmers faintly in the candlelight despite being hundreds of years old, and you marvel at how the script remains so crisp, So painfully neat, so impossibly consistent. And then you remember the medieval legend claiming the monk wrote the entire thing in a single night with the devil's assistance. Yes, that legend. The one scholars dismiss as myth but still feel compelled to mention in footnotes with the cautious phrasing. The matter remains open to debate, which is academic code for, look, something weird happened, but we're not losing tenure over it. You feel the eyes of the devil illustration burning a hole through the pages even though you haven't reached that section yet, as though it knows you're coming. And honestly, there's nothing more unsettling than being psychically anticipated by 800-year-old ink. The room tightens around you, as if noticing that you are not simply observing, but inviting the manuscript to reveal itself, and the air grows colder. Not unpleasantly, more like the chilly breeze that comes when a fridge door is left open too long, which would be totally normal if this weren't a sealed archive 10 meters underground with no ventilation. You keep reading, tracing the carefully measured lines of text, noting how every page seems to subtly respond to your breath, like a sleeping animal twitching in its dreams. And you can't help but laugh quietly at the absurdity of this moment, because somewhere above your head, tourists are probably complaining about the gift shop prices while you're here, casually awakening a medieval artifact with questionable allegiances. The manuscript's presence grows heavier, a pressure behind your sternum, like awareness settling in, and your thoughts flicker back to that time we talked about crocodile dung sunscreen. A reminder that humans have always made questionable decisions, and reading a potentially cursed manuscript in a restricted Vatican archive at midnight absolutely qualifies. But hey, you committed. As you turn to the illuminated devil portrait, your breath catches because, even knowing what to expect, nothing prepares you for the expression. It is not wicked or gleeful or frightening. It is curious. The devil looks like he's waiting for you to ask him a question, maybe about philosophy or interior design, and that ambiguity, that subtle invitation, is far more disturbing than any overt menace. The candles sputter again, and while you could blame air pressure changes or the movement of warm human bodies, you can't shake the feeling that the room is reacting to your attention, almost feeding on it. You step back instinctively, and the shadow of the book stretches across the floor, elongated in a way that doesn't match the angle of the candles. A small detail your brain tries to rationalize with geometry before giving up and filing it under nope. As you stand there, listening to your heartbeat echo in a room designed for silence, you sense a shift, not in the book, but in you, as though the Codex Gigas is quietly taking your measure, trying to decide whether you are a reader or a threat, an intruder or a participant in a much older story. And as the last candle steadies, its flame rising tall and strangely still, you realize this manuscript is not simply a relic, but the opening move in the secret war that will soon pull you deeper into the Vatican than any living guide could lead you. A war ignited centuries ago by a pope determined to destroy this very book. A pope whose reasons will unravel everything you think you know about good, evil, and the thin, trembling thread stretched between them as the devil's portrait continues to stare, not menacing, not mocking, but expectant, like someone who already knows how your story ends. You leave the archive with the devil's curious stare still clinging to your thoughts, its ink-made eyes following you like a polite but unsettling dinner guest who isn't sure whether it's been invited or summoned. And as you step into the long hallway of the restricted wing, the temperature shifts again, not colder this time, but warmer, almost humid, as though someone recently exhaled centuries of breath into the stone passage. And with each step you take, you begin to sense the presence of a man who has been dead for 800 years, but somehow never left these walls. A man known in fragments and footnotes, in half-remembered monastic whispers, in archivist superstitions. The monk said to have written the Codex Gigas, the monk who, as legend insists, wouldn't die. You walk slowly, hands tracing the cool stone, following the faint scent of iron-based ink and candle smoke, until you reach a narrow stairwell spiraling downward like the throat of some dormant beast that has forgotten how to swallow, and descending it feels a bit like stepping into a medieval memory foam mattress. Every footfall sinks deeper than expected, and you're fairly certain this staircase violates at least 7 modern safety regulations. But then again, the Vatican has never been known for its enthusiasm for OSHA guidelines. You reach a small subterranean reading chamber lit by a single lamp, its glow forming a golden halo around an antique table where a folio lies open as if waiting for you. And you can't help thinking the room feels staged, like someone or something wanted you here. The folio contains copies of testimonies from the Benedictine monastery of Poblasus, where the Codex Gigas was created, and as you lean in, the inked letters seem to shift slightly, as though stirred by your breath, which is unsettling because you specifically inhaled away from the page to avoid that exact phenomenon. The testimonies describe the monk, his name lost to time, referred to only by titles like the penitent or the scribe, and they paint a portrait of a man who lived under a vow of silence so absolute it became less a promise and more a personality trait. The kind of vow that makes you wonder whether he took it because he desired spiritual discipline or simply because he was extremely tired of medieval small talk, which, to be fair, probably revolved around crop yields and whose turn it was to clean the latrine pits. The mainstream historical fact woven through these documents is that medieval scriptoria demanded immense discipline and labor, with monks spending years copying manuscripts with monastic precision, often beginning before sunrise and ending long after sunset, creating works of staggering detail without the benefit of caffeine, ergonomic chairs, or the modern joy known as complaining on the internet. And yet, even in that world of extraordinary devotion, the scribe of the Codex Gigas stood, apart because of the impossible speed with which he seemed to work. But tucked among the testimonies is a strange, quirky tidbit, almost a joke if it weren't delivered with such monastic seriousness, that the monk occasionally appeared in two places at once, spotted in the scriptorium and later reported in the chapel during the same hour, a rumor attributed by some to simple confusion, by others to the devil's assistance, and by one particularly dry witness to the imagination of brothers who need more sleep, which is honestly the most relatable line in any medieval manuscript. You keep reading, and the tone of the testimony shifts, becoming darker, more fearful, as though the monks struggled to articulate something they didn't fully understand, something that grew around the scribe like a second shadow. They describe how he worked without pause, how he resisted fatigue in a manner that seemed almost unnatural, and how, in the deepest hours of the night, he sometimes hummed a single, low melody without moving his lips, a detail that would be delightfully spooky if it weren't also deeply annoying to imagine when you're trying to sleep in a communal dormitory. One monk even claimed the scribe's heartbeat was unusually slow, like the rhythm of an old clock, though whether this was awe, fear, or a creative attempt to describe bradycardia, we may never know. Scholars have debated these accounts for centuries, and one margin note in the folio uses the cautious academic phrasing, "The matter remains open to debate," meaning experts can't decide whether the monk was extraordinarily disciplined, divinely inspired, sleep-deprived, supernatural, or simply running on the medieval equivalent of an energy drink, which was probably just wine mixed with optimism. You press your fingers against the page, feeling the indentation of long-dead handwriting, and you sense the presence of the monk lingering in this quiet room, not in a frightening way, but in the way old grief or unfinished work sometimes lingers, a gentle, stubborn echo that refuses to fade. The testimonies describe how the monk was condemned to produce a manuscript that would glorify the monastery, a punishment for a grave sin lost to history, and how he promised to create a book containing the entirety of human knowledge in a single night. A statement so unhinged it reads like the medieval version of procrastinating a semester-long assignment until the night before it's due. And then comes the detail scholars can't quite reconcile. The monk completed it, or at least appeared to, within a span no human could realistically manage, a claim that forces them into uncomfortable corners where faith, skepticism, and the limits of biology all shake hands and pretend they're not judging each other. You feel the weight of that mystery press into you, like the silent nod of someone standing just out of view, and without realizing it, you start imagining the monk's hands, cracked and ink-stained, moving across parchment with a speed born not of desperation but of compulsion, like someone who knew the night itself had expectations. The documents mention how he aged strangely, not slower, not faster, but unevenly, appearing youthful one month and noticeably older the next, a detail the monks found too disturbing to discuss openly, though one dry-witted scribe wrote in the margin, "Perhaps he moisturizes with fear," which, honestly, is a joke that deserved more medieval appreciation. As the hours passed, the monk grew less like a member of the community and more like a fixture within the monastery, a presence threaded into the rhythm of candlelight and quill scratching, and you sensed that he became something between man and myth long before the final page of the codex was turned. And then, as you flip to the final testimony, the lamp above you flickers, though you suspect this is more a commentary on ancient wiring than on supernatural forces, and the last recorded account reveals something that sends a cold shiver across your spine. The monk didn't die. Not properly, not in the way people usually do. According to the testimony, he simply stopped being seen, as though he had stepped backward into the manuscript, dissolving into the ink that consumed him, and the account ends with a single ominous line. His presence remains, written in a hand so shaky it seems etched by someone who desperately wished not to write it. You exhale slowly, letting the weight of 800 years settle over you like dust, and the air feels charged again, as though the monk's last breath is still lingering in this room, waiting for recognition. You close the folio gently, aware that this story is no longer merely historical curiosity, but a thread leading you deeper into a mystery that intertwines the living, the dead, and a manuscript that seems unwilling to sleep. You rise, stepping back toward the stairwell, but the room feels reluctant to let you go, and you realize you've crossed an invisible threshold, the point where curiosity becomes involvement, where the story stops being something you study and becomes something that studies you. And as you climb upward into the quiet corridors, you feel the monk's silent footsteps following, not threateningly but expectantly, as though he has been waiting centuries for someone awake enough, foolish enough, or simply lonely enough to continue the work he began. You move back through the narrowing Vatican corridor with the sense that the monk's quiet footsteps are pacing just behind your own, not haunting you exactly, but reminding you that the path you've chosen is less a walkway and more a conveyor belt pulling you toward a story you were never meant to hear. And as you reach a wider chamber where the air tastes faintly of incense and cold marble, you begin to understand why the Codex Gigas unsettled not only its creators, but one particular pope whose shadow still lingers in this place like a stubborn scent trapped in old fabric. A pope whose determination to destroy the devil's Bible ignited a conflict so secret it never made its way into official records, which, knowing the Vatican, is both suspicious and completely on brand. You step into a private archive hall, its vaulted ceiling echoing faintly with the quiet hum of electricity from modern climate control that the church pretends isn't there. And at the far end sits a locked cabinet adorned with a crest you vaguely recognize from late medieval papal coins, a small flourish of crossed keys, and a starburst that always looked more decorative than doctrinal, but now radiates the kind of symbolic importance that makes your stomach tighten as though you've just realized you've parked your car in the wrong neighborhood. Inside the cabinet lies a slender bundle of sealed documents bound together with crimson cord, the kind that says, "Please do not open," in the same passive-aggressive tone as a mislabeled Tupperware in a shared office fridge. And naturally you open it anyway, because curiosity is your fatal flaw, or at least the one that gets you into the most interesting rooms. The bundle contains correspondence from Pope Benedict IX, or at least attributed to him, though historians dispute exactly which Benedict IX wrote them because, as the mainstream historical fact acknowledges, Benedict IX served as pope on 3 separate occasions between 1032 and 1048, a chaotic papal resume that still confuses scholars and occasionally inspires jokes about medieval HR departments. The letters, written in hurried Latin with slanted, frantic strokes, describe a manuscript of tremendous danger and insidious silence, a text he believed capable of undermining the Church's moral authority, not by preaching evil, but by presenting knowledge so vast, so meticulously ordered, so relentlessly complete that it threatened to place divine understanding in the hands of a single scribe rather than centuries of theological evolution. And you can't help appreciating how threatened institutions become when someone organizes information too efficiently. Wikipedia editors can relate. One fringe tidbit appears halfway through a letter. Benedict claims the devil's portrait inside the Codex Gigas shifted slightly in expression when he looked upon it alone at night, a detail that reads like either early psychological stress or the kind of story religious leaders tell when trying to convince colleagues that a book is, in fact, not ideal for public use. But the alarming part is that this particular pope didn't just fear the manuscript. He believed someone, or something, was protecting it. He writes of hearing footsteps pacing outside his chamber at night, steps that stopped whenever he opened the door but resumed the moment he returned to his bed. And although modern historians politely attribute this to palace guards, one unnerving line in the margin reads, "The guards were all inside with me." Scholars argue, politely, with academic finesse, but also the suppressed panic of people afraid to admit uncertainty, and the letters repeatedly include the phrase, "The matter remains open to debate," which is caution disguised as scholarship, as though no one wants to commit too firmly to the idea of a haunted Pope mobile or an ambulatory manuscript. You run your fingers over one letter's edges, feeling the delicate, uneven fibers of ancient parchment, and as you read further, you learn that Benedict attempted to convene a secret council of trusted clergy to discuss the destruction of the Codex Gigas, convening them in a hidden chamber beneath the Vatican gardens, a chamber that apparently no longer exists, officially anyway, because renovation maps never mention it, and archivists react to inquiries about subterranean chambers with the polite evasiveness of someone pretending not to know who ate the last cannoli. The Pope's plan was alarmingly straightforward. Seize the manuscript, carry it in secret to a remote monastery, and burn it before dawn in a ritual of purification involving prayer, salt, and a surprising amount of olive oil, which, considering how medieval people used olive oil as a fix-all, from cooking to cleaning to skincare, you suspect may have been a theological improvisation. But according to the final letter in the bundle, the plan failed before it even began. On the night the council assembled, the Codex Gigas vanished from its guarded room, leaving behind only a faint scorch mark on the table, a detail that unsettled Benedict so deeply he insisted it was not a burn but the imprint of a presence departing unwillingly, which is the kind of statement that sends shivers down your spine even as you remind yourself that medieval leaders occasionally dramatize things for effect. The disappearance created chaos within the secret council, with accusations flying, faith shaken, and Benedict convinced that forces beyond human comprehension were at work, though whether those forces were divine, diabolical, or simply bureaucratic incompetence remains, yes, open to debate. The Pope's writings grow increasingly frantic as the weeks pass, referencing shadows that move counter to candlelight, pages turning on their own, and a lingering sense that the scribe who wrote the Codex Gigas still serves it from beyond death, which might sound absurd if you hadn't just spent an entire evening feeling exactly that presence tailing you like a patient housecat with unresolved spiritual concerns. You lift the last document, Benedict's final letter, before he mysteriously ceased mentioning the manuscript altogether, and the writing trembles across the parchment as if his hand had battled not physical weakness but dread. He writes, "The book cannot be destroyed. It chooses its guardians." And as you finish reading, the room feels suddenly smaller, its ceiling bowing inward as though listening, and you feel the monk's silent breath behind your neck, not cold, not warm, but aware. You realize, in a slow, creeping ripple of understanding, that you've been drafted into this ancient conflict, not as a warrior or a pope, but as someone who happened to look too long at a manuscript that does not appreciate casual attention. And as you replace the letters in their cabinet, the crimson cord seems tighter than before, as though binding secrets that resent being disturbed. You step backward into the hall, heartbeat steady but mind racing. And once again the sensation of being followed pulls at your awareness, not threateningly but expectantly, the way a teacher waits for a student to realize they've asked the wrong question. You inhale the lingering incense, exhale centuries of dust, and step deeper into the Vatican, drawn now toward the shadowed vaults where the truth behind the Codex Gigas waits, coiled and patient, eager for the next turn of your restless curiosity. You move deeper into the Vatican as though guided by a memory that isn't yours, the corridor ahead narrowing into an older, quieter artery of the palace where the air cools and the walls shift from polished Renaissance elegance into rougher medieval stone, the kind carved before aesthetics mattered and long before tourists were a concern. And the moment your fingertips brush its coarse surface, you feel that same pulse you sensed in the archive, a faint thrum like distant chanting muffled behind. Centuries of dust and denial, drawing you toward Rome's shadow vaults. The places the church insists do not exist, even though every archivist with a pulse knows exactly where they are. You descend a spiraling staircase far steeper than any architect with a conscience would approve of, and your breath echoes upward like a rope unspooling behind you as the darkness thickens into something viscous. Not quite fog, but not quite empty air either. The kind of darkness that feels inhabited even when logic tells you it's just lack of light. At the base of the steps lies a narrow landing with an iron door half swallowed by stone. Its hinges the color of forgotten centuries, and etched into the metal is an emblem you've already come to associate with trouble. The same starburst and keys design from the letters of Benedict IX, except here it appears less decorative and more defensive, as though warning you that everything past this point is part of a story the church itself became afraid to tell. The door opens with a low groan, because of course it does, and reveals a long vault lined with shelves of artifacts that never made it into official inventories. A museum of things the Vatican prefers to keep in the same category as awkward family secrets. And that time medieval doctors thought leeches were the answer to everything. The vault smells of vellum and cold metal and something faintly sweet, like dried herbs long past their potency. And as you walk between the shelves, you feel watched not by eyes, but by intentions, as if objects themselves remember who moved them last. Here rests the mainstream historical fact. The Vatican's Archivum Secretum, despite sounding like the setting for a Dan Brown fever dream, was historically just the private archive of the papacy, containing correspondence, documents, and restricted materials not because they were sinister, but because kings, emperors, and popes all like to hoard knowledge the way dragons hoard gold. Yet beneath that respectable archive lies this other place, rarely spoken of, rarely entered, where articles, connected to theological danger or supernatural rumors, were quietly stored away to prevent scandal, fear, or misplaced enthusiasm among the faithful. You take in the shelves, noting everything from broken chalices to sealed scrolls, from relic boxes to odd wooden fragments shaped in ways the human hand does not naturally carve. And just when you think your evening can't get any stranger, you catch a glimpse of a small glass vial labeled in Latin as terra obscura, which some fringe historians claim is soil taken from beneath a monastery where the earth hummed at night. A detail so bizarre you almost laugh, except the vial vibrates ever so slightly, as though remembering its old song. You move on quickly, deciding that some curiosities are better appreciated from a distance, and press further until the vault curves into a secondary chamber lit by a line of small electric lamps the Vatican would never publicly admit to installing. Their sterile glow reveals a wide table covered in manuscripts and fragments of research, all devoted to one topic repeated like a nervous tick, the Codex Gigas. Papers sprawl across the tabletop, describing impossible attempts to trace the manuscript's post-medieval travels, theories about its alleged relocation during conflicts, and notes on how several popes quietly reviewed it during times of crisis, reading its pages not for wisdom but for warning, as if the book itself served as a barometer for spiritual or political upheaval. One handwritten entry catches your eye. The scribe persists. The phrase is underlined 3 times, as though the writer wanted to make sure no one forgot it, or perhaps hoped by underlining it they could somehow contain its truth. Beside it lies a document stamped with an internal Vatican seal, summarizing an investigation conducted in the 1700s into sightings of a hooded figure wandering the apostolic library after midnight, always silent, always solitary, leaving behind a faint odor of ink and burned parchment. The official conclusion, delivered with masterful bureaucratic vagueness, simply states, "The matter remains open to debate," which is academic shorthand for "we have no idea, and we prefer not to talk about it." You lean closer, the dim light sharpening every letter, and you sense the monk's presence again, not malicious, not benevolent, just patient, like someone who has been waiting centuries for a chance to finish a conversation interrupted by death. But before you can contemplate that unsettling thought, a strange draft brushes your left cheek, even though there are no windows or vents. And when you follow the breeze, you discover a narrow passage partially concealed by shelving, its entrance framed by two pillars eroded by time. The passage slopes downward, carrying you deeper into Rome's unseen layers where the air grows dense, metallic, mineral, like breathing inside the memory of a mountain, and your footsteps echo against stone that predates papal authority entirely, stone carved when Rome was young and the church was only a whisper in the wind. At the end of the passage lies a circular chamber, its ceiling low and its walls painted with faint frescoes of angels and demons interwoven in spirals, each figure reaching toward the center of the room, where a heavy stone pedestal sits covered by a cloth so thick and dark it absorbs the little light that reaches it. The pedestal radiates an energy that pricks at your skin, the same awareness you felt in the archive, but stronger, heavier, like the book is not sitting on the pedestal but exhaling through it. When you pull back the cloth, your heart lurches because for a split second you expect the Codex Gigas itself, but instead you find a wooden box, intricately carved with symbols of protection, sealing, and banishment, the kind used in medieval rites to contain objects deemed spiritually volatile, which is a polite way of saying things that do not behave well. The lid creaks as it opens, revealing a stack of parchment fragments, copies of sections from the Codex Gigas that no longer exist in the main manuscript. These fragments contain amendments, corrections, even whole passages the monk seems to have drafted after the book's completion, as though he were continuing to write in a manuscript that was already bound and sealed. One fragment is especially chilling, a drawing of the devil, not seated as he appears in the known illustration, but standing, facing forward, arms extended in a gesture that seems almost welcoming, almost relieved. You feel your breath catch as the devil's eyes in the sketch seem to meet yours, just for an instant, just long enough to make you wonder whether the ink is changing or whether you're simply sleep-deprived to a spiritually irresponsible degree. Another fragment reveals a passage glossed with red ink describing a keeper who cannot die, clearly referencing the monk, and the note includes a line that reads, "He walks even now, bound to the book until its last breath," a statement so unervingly specific that for a moment you consider leaving the vault and pretending you never saw any of this. But the story isn't done with you, not yet, and your curiosity, that gentle self-destructive trait, nudges you to keep going. As you study the fragments, you begin to see patterns, little threads of continuity, hints that the Codex Gigas might not be a single finished text, but a living project, an ongoing collaboration between the scribe and something far older, far quieter, something that never truly allows its scribes to leave. And then the chamber lights flicker, once, twice, and a faint shadow crosses the far wall, slow and deliberate, too tall and too fluid to be human, moving with a confidence that suggests it already knows the limits of your courage. The shadow lingers for a breath, then melts back into the stone as though stepping into a different layer of reality, leaving behind only a faint smell of ink and cold ashes. You exhale shakily, realizing you are standing in the heart of a secret war fought not with armies or doctrines, but with words and silence, manuscripts and shadows. And as you replace the cloth over the box, the chamber feels less like a room and more like a sealed confession whispered by centuries. You step backward toward the passage, aware now that the Codex Gigas, wherever it is, has started to watch you as closely as you are watching it. And as you return to the upper vault, the quiet hum of electric lamps seems to sound a little too much like breathing, as though the walls themselves are waiting for your next move, waiting for you to follow this story all the way to the final confrontation that has been building since the night the monk first dipped his quill into ink and wrote words. Meant to outlive the world, you emerge from the shadow vaults with the sensation that something unseen has followed you up the stairwell, not quite a presence but a pressure, as though the air itself has become denser, folding gently around your movements like a cloak woven out of centuries. And as you walk the dim corridor, you feel that same faint hum you sensed in the chamber below, the subtle vibration of a story reaching its final chapter, whether you are ready or not. Because every path you've taken tonight, every corridor, every page, every whisper of ink, has been leading you toward a single moment, the last reading of the Devil's Bible. You follow the narrowing hallway until it opens into a chamber you've never seen before, a place absent from all architectural diagrams, illuminated only by a ring of small lanterns casting soft golden halos across ancient stone, and at the center of the room sits a pedestal familiar enough now that your skin prickles with a quiet, resigned awareness. This one is different, though. There's no cloth covering the object, no attempt to hide it, no effort to pretend the manuscript is elsewhere. Instead, the Codex Gigas sits fully exposed under the lantern's glow, and you sense immediately that this room, unlike the vaults below, is not for containment. It is for judgment. You approach with slow steps, drawn forward by a mixture of dread and inevitability. And as you reach the edge of the pedestal, the enormous book appears almost peaceful, its vellum cover smooth and faintly warm, as though absorbing the lantern light. You rest your fingertips lightly on the edge, expecting the familiar pulse or shifting shadow, but instead you feel something quieter, a stillness, a presence waiting not to start something, but to finish it. You open the manuscript to the center where the devil's portrait resides, and the image meets you with an expression that seems less curious now and more knowing, as if the devil has been waiting for you to return ever since your first glance in the archive. The mainstream historical fact comes to mind as you study the portrait. The Codex Gigas is the largest surviving medieval manuscript in the world, taller than most children and heavier than an anvil, requiring 2 people to lift and centuries of caretakers to preserve, a feat of human craftsmanship so extraordinary that scholars still marvel at the consistency of its script. Yet none of those facts explain the way the portrait seems to shift its weight ever so slightly, like someone settling into a chair before speaking. The lanterns flicker, and an almost theatrical breeze sweeps across the chamber despite the absence of any visible opening, carrying with it a faint smell of ink, dust, and something metallic. And as you turn the pages, you find passages you've never seen before, sections not present in any known facsimile or archive copy. These pages describe the monk not as a sinner or a penitent, but as a bearer, someone chosen not by divine appointment, but by the manuscript itself. And the ink seems newer, fresher, as though it were written after the book's supposed completion, or perhaps after the monk's disappearance from recorded history. A fringe tidbit leaps out from the margin, written in a style inconsistent with the rest of the text. The scribe does not walk upright when the moon is gone. A line so bizarre you assume at first it's some medieval attempt at metaphor, until you remember the shadow you saw lingering in the vault, that too-tall figure moving with a fluid confidence that wasn't entirely human. You turn another page and find the text shifting between languages, some Latin, some Greek, some in a script that seems to move when you're not looking directly at it. The kind of linguistic irregularity scholars would argue about endlessly with phrases like, "the matter remains open to debate," which is their gentle way of saying, we refuse to acknowledge this might be supernatural, because we value our careers. You keep reading until the manuscript settles on a final page, one you've never seen reproduced anywhere, a page containing a single paragraph written in ink that seems to darken as your eyes settle on it, as though it has been waiting to be read again after centuries of silence. The passage speaks of a final guardian, someone who would witness the last reading, someone who would carry the remaining breath of the manuscript into the world when the scribe's long vigil finally ends. The lanterns dim slightly, and you feel footsteps behind you. Not the monk's slow, rhythmic steps, but something lighter, quicker, almost like the flutter of pages turning themselves. You don't turn around. Some instinct tells you not to. Instead, you continue reading, absorbing the final words even though you don't fully understand them, and the manuscript grows warmer beneath your hands, almost pulsing like a heartbeat. The air thickens. The lantern flames stretch upward as though pulled by invisible strings, and the devil's portrait seems to smile, not cruelly but with relief, the kind of expression someone might wear after holding a burden for far too long. You step back instinctively, and the entire room shifts in tone, the lantern light softening into a warm, sleepy glow, wrapping around your senses with a gentleness you didn't expect. The manuscript closes itself, not with violence, not with drama, but with a quiet finality, like someone sighing at the end of a long story. You feel the monk beside you now, not in body but in presence, a gentle acknowledgement that his vigil is ending, that his centuries-long tether to the Codex Gigas has loosened because you have read what needed to be read, witnessed what needed to be witnessed. And in these final 300 words, you feel the shift from tension to calm, like a tide receding, leaving behind smooth sand and soft edges. The lanterns glow lower, settling into a warm amber that soothes the mind rather than alarms it, and the air becomes gentle, almost warm, as if exhaling after years of being held too tightly. You breathe in, and the air carries hints of old parchment and candle smoke, familiar now, comforting even, the lingering scent of a story concluding at last. The presence of the monk drifts like a fading echo, not disappearing but settling quietly into the memory of the room, no longer burdened by centuries of unfinished guardianship. The devil's portrait softens in the dimming light, no longer sharp or expectant, just a page in a book, just ink on vellum, finally allowed to rest. You feel your own breath slow, your thoughts soften, the heavy tension of the night dissolving into something warm and quiet, something like acceptance. The manuscript lies still, its secrets finally whispered, its weight finally eased. And as you step back toward the corridor, the world feels softer, slower, as though wrapped in gentle fabric. Each step grows lighter, the shadows less intrusive, the silence more like a lullaby. The Vatican around you hums faintly, not with secrets now, but with peace. And the story that chased you through halls and vaults settles carefully into your mind like a final candle being extinguished after a long night's vigil. The path ahead glows with the faint promise of rest, of quiet, of safety. And as you take your final step from the chamber, everything fades into a soft, soothing stillness, carrying you gently toward sleep.